Good morning, church. My name is Joshua Young, Associate Pastor of Connections at Clear Lake Presbyterian Church. As a reminder, we are worshiping together on Zoom this Sunday morning at 10 a.m. If you're watching this sermon after the fact and have missed it, we are going to put a recording up of our time together on our YouTube channel shortly after it ends. Our scripture today comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 8 through 23. Hear the word of the Lord. Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I will have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with the stewardship. What then is my reward? That is in my preaching, I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Church, this summer we are going through Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church. Last week, Pastor Rachel talked about Paul's call to the Corinthians to forego their rights to participate in pagan festivals for the sake of loving the weaker and more vulnerable members among them. And it's a discussion that really carries over throughout chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Paul's letter, including the passage from chapter 9 that we read today. But another theme that carries on throughout this book, and really for much of the Apostle Paul's ministry, is his singular focus on preaching the gospel. Paul's passion and mission in life is to reach as many people as he can with the saving news of God's redemption for the world through Jesus Christ. It is a theme that shines throughout this passage, and I would argue is the overarching passion that is driving this conversation about prioritizing love for the vulnerable in the church over exerting their rights to eat meat at pagan festivals. It's this passion for the free and unencumbered preaching of the gospel that drives Paul earlier in chapter 9 to talk about some of the rights that he has laid aside for the sake of the gospel. The right to travel with a believing wife, or the right to receive wages for his teaching ministry. During this period of history, great teachers of philosophy and rhetoric would give teachings in the public square in cities like Corinth. And if they were good enough to have an audience, they might be invited back for private sessions in homes for select groups of people, for a higher fee, of course. No doubt the Corinthian church would have been accustomed to seeing this practice done, and may have been a little put off by Paul not wanting to take money or fees for his work of preaching. Paul, as we know from other places, including the book of Acts, that he made his living making tents instead. However, Paul's reasoning for not taking these fees is very simple. It's so that he can preach the gospel free of charge to whomever is willing and able to hear him. as opposed to being tied down to a select group of financial benefactors. In some ways, this laying down of his rights to these fees and wages brings with it a different kind of freedom, a freedom to preach the gospel with minimal restrictions. It's a passion for the good news of Jesus Christ that drives Paul in verse 19 to lower himself as a servant to all people, in order to earn a hearing with the people around him. He writes, "I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." This lowering himself as a humble servant stands in contrast against the teachers of philosophy and rhetoric who would have come with well-crafted and flowery speeches and great aplomb. Paul's message, as alluded to earlier in this letter, was simple and perhaps unimpressive, but was indeed singular focused on the redemptive work of God through Jesus Christ. This servanthood is manifested by Paul in his ability to be amorphous and accommodating to the cultures and customs of the people with whom he has been called to preach. It's reasonable to assume, based on this passage, that when Paul was among the Jews, he more than likely practiced Jewish customs, their eating practices, their festival observances. And he more than likely made those same accommodations when he was preaching to the Gentiles, referred to in this passage as the lawless, practicing their customs and observing their festivals. This reference to becoming weak is probably an allusion to his earlier discussion with the Corinthians about choosing to abstain from eating meat and taking part in the pagan festivals for the sake of the weak and vulnerable members among them. Reading this passage reminds me of a quote by the famous martial artist and actor Bruce Lee. When asked about his overarching life philosophy, in an interview he answered, "Be formless, shapeless like water." Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. Put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, water can crash. Be water, my friend. And it strikes me that what Bruce Lee and what the Apostle Paul understood, whether it be about martial arts or preaching the gospel, is the importance of being flexible and adaptable in order to accomplish one's goals. In Paul's case, the free preaching of the gospel. I think it's very easy to read Paul's passage here and misinterpret him as conforming to sinful, idolatrous practices, or that he's somehow compromising his principles because of social pressure. But you see, that's not what's going on here. Paul is quick to point out that as a Jesus follower, he's not beholden to Jewish ceremonial law, nor is he compromising his beliefs in God as someone who is quote-unquote lawless in any way. Rather, Paul's standards of accountability come first and foremost from the law of Jesus Christ, the law of the Messiah, and all that he does is for the proclamation and demonstration of the good news to all who would hear it without barrier. So over the last few weeks, I've been reading a book called Native by Caitlin Curtis. Caitlin is a Native American Christian author who is a member of the Potawatomi tribe. And in this book, Caitlin talks about her experiences and struggles as an Indigenous Christian. It's no secret that for many Indigenous peoples, there's a fractured relationship with the church and Christianity due to the violence, the forced migration, and harmful assimilation practices they experienced under colonialism and under colonial Christianity. And one of the things this book wrestles with is trying to find ways for the church to address these past wrongs and to find a path toward justice and reconciliation between Christians and Indigenous people groups. I appreciate the vision Curtis sets forth about what this could look like. In Native, she writes this: "Approaching Indigenous culture with the goal of getting Native peoples in the pews isn't an answer. It is merely an extension of colonization. Perhaps the church should consider that Indigenous peoples have more to teach the church than the church has to teach Indigenous peoples. Perhaps that would change how the relationship works. The important aspect of this relationship is that it is a partnership, a space in which listening really happens, a space in which Indigenous people are paid for their time and resources by the church itself, if asked. As I said earlier, Indigenous people shouldn't have to spend our days educating non-native people. But when we are willing to partner with institutions like the church for a better future, we should be heard. For those of us who claim to carry the good news of Jesus Christ with us, and whose desire it is to share it with others, I wonder what it would look like to approach Indigenous and other marginalized communities with an attitude of humility as learners first, as opposed to an attitude that presumes that we have all the answers. I wonder what it would look like to actively listen before speaking, to weep with them about the issues that make them weep, to take joy in their customs and celebrations, to know how to receive the voices of others first with understanding and empathy, before asserting our rights to speak and interject. How might God work through a church whose posture is one of humility and of laying aside our rights, for the sake of loving and partnering with others as together we proclaim the liberating, saving work of God in Jesus Christ? How might we as God's people be transformed? It strikes me that in a city like Houston, one of the most, if not the most diverse city in the United States, we have an opportunity every day to learn from and put at the forefront the diversity of customs, cultures, and communities around us as a sign of our deep love of Jesus Christ and our deep love of people. Church, may we answer that call together as faithful stewards of the gospel of Jesus Christ.